Okay, this is the last section for this chapter, focusing on the spinal cord and spinal nerves. So let's start off talking about the spinal meninges. So just like the brain has meninges, the spinal cord is also going to have these meninges, and they're going to be pretty much the same. Slightly different structures. So duramater, acronoid mater, pia mater. We also have that subarachnoid space again. The duramater is structured a bit differently. And so around the brain, it has those two layers of connective tissue with that superior sagittal sinus sandwiched in between them. Whereas around the spinal column, there is a single layer of connective tissue for that duramater. So it is only one layer. All right, and that duramater can extend through the intervertebral foramen and fuse with the connective tissues covering the spinal nerves that we just talked about in the previous video. All right, but other than that, the acronoid mater, subacronoid space, and then pia mater are all going to look very, very similar to the coverings that we saw around the brain. An additional structure that we find around the spinal cord that is not up in the brain is the epidural space. So epi means on top of, dural for duramater. So this is kind of on top of or outside of that duramater. So this is between that duramater and the periosteum of the bone. And this is going to be a space. It's going to be full of areolar and adipose connective tissue, so it's going to look like fatty tissue on the models and stuff. There's also blood vessels going through there, and so that's, again, only around the spinal cord. So if anybody has had epidurals for labor or other reasons, that's not the only reason epidurals are done. That drug, the anesthesia there, is injected into that epidural space. All right, there are other types of epidural injections. Sometimes they can be steroid injections to try to reduce inflammation and stuff like that. But it is very common to have that epidural anesthesia put into that particular space here. And that doesn't have as great of a risk of puncturing the spinal cord itself. So that makes it relatively safe. Relatively. All right, there's also going to be all that cerebrospinal fluid again, but let's talk about blood supply. So just like the brain needs blood supply, so does the spinal cord. So we do have arteries and veins coming to this region. So there are 3 spinal arteries that sit longitudinally, so straight up and down, supplying the anterior and posterior regions of the spinal cord, and they're also connected through the pia mater through what are called arteriovasicorona, and those are going to supply the lateral portions of the spinal cord. So this will kind of wrap around the spinal cord a little bit with those cross connections so that all sections of the spinal cord get that blood supply. And then there are tons and tons and tons of other arteries that divide through the anterior and posterior radicular arteries. And so these are all going to help make sure that there's plenty of blood supply. We do still have that kind of blood-brain barrier. We do not want pathogens and toxins easily getting into the central nervous system. So we are not really going to be diving in super, super deep. But we do still need some of that blood supply going to that region. Then we have the venous return. So we have a lot of veins and venous plexuses around the spinal cord that drain blood from it. And conveniently, all of those veins share the exact same names as the arteries that are bringing blood to the spinal cord to begin with. All right, so we've already learned a lot of the spinal cord anatomy in lab, so this should be quite a bit of a refresher. So we do have the spinal cord divided into 3 main regions corresponding to the vertebral column region. So we've got cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. The spinal cord actually ends at the top of the lumbar vertebrae region, so around vertebrae 1 and 2 of those lumbar vertebrae, and it tapers into that conus medullaris structure corresponding to the sacral spinal cord region. right? And this is actually because our spinal cord doesn't really keep growing throughout our life like the rest of our body does, or at least until we reach adulthood. And so it's just not going to keep growing down to be in our full spinal column. So it does stop growing earlier on in life, after about 2-ish years old, actually. There's not significant growth after about 2 years of age. But the skeleton obviously continues to grow, and so that spinal cord ends earlier than other structures. Our torso doesn't grow a ton as we get older. It's largely the legs and arms that are, the legs especially, that are going to give us a lot more height versus the torso. It will grow a bit, but not significantly, right? And then coming out of that conus medullaris is the cauda equina, those bundles of nerves coming out down there. Those are going to continue down through the lumbar region and the sacral region. And then there is a very thin strand of that pia mater layer called the filum terminale that's going to help anchor the conus medullaris to the coccyx, actually. So making sure that the spinal cord isn't going to risk kind of bunching upwards or anything like that. So really just kind of keeping the spinal cord where it's supposed to be. So this might be a little easier to see visually. So there's our cervical region, thoracic, lumbar region, and then sacral region, which is largely made up of the cauda equina. So you can see here's our conus medullaris right up here towards that lower portion of the thoracic region and upper lumbar vertebrae. And so if we zoom in down here by the sacrum, here's that filum terminale that's going to kind of anchor in that pia mater and keep it fused to the coccyx further down here, so that we're not risking the spinal cord like bunching up towards the cervical region. All right, let's talk about roots, ganglia, and meninges a bit more. So axons come out of the posterior root ganglion. This was a structure we learned in lab last week. These enter the posterior side of the body through the dorsal or posterior nerve root, marking a posterolateral sulcus on either side. And then the axons coming out of the anterior side go through that ventral or anterior nerve root, and those will end up fusing together. The posterior and anterior nerve roots fuse together to form the actual spinal nerves themselves. All right. So here is that cross section. So here's the vertebrae in gray. There is the spinal cord itself. This is going to be that dorsal root ganglion. Here's the ventral root, and so those end up fusing together out here into the rami and rami communicantes that we learned in lab, that we're not actually seeing the communicantes section here. We can see the dorsal and ventral ramus, but this is a single spinal nerve, and that will kind of keep branching off to the anterior and posterior sides of the body. And then you can see that epidural space around it. And if we zoom in a bit more, here's that dura mater. Here is going to be the acronoid, subacronoid space in here, which is going to have the cerebrospinal fluid, and then the pia mater lining directly on the surface of the spinal cord. All right, so continuing with this discussion about cross-section of the spinal cord, which is this view right here. We covered a lot of this in lab recently. So the spinal cord, unlike the brain, kind of maintains that tube structure, that start of that neural tube, and so that central canal ends up being what is remaining of the central portion of that tube, but otherwise we just kind of get this slow development of these other minor structures, but it does maintain that tube-like shape a lot. So we've got the anterior median fissure and then the posterior median sulcus that are going to be located again on the anterior and posterior sides, and then the axons come out near each of those regions, or structures rather. So those nerve roots. More in the central, we have that central canal. That is that continuation of the fourth ventricle of the brain. It's going to have cerebrospinal fluid in it. And that is surrounded by that gray commissure, so that gray matter, which will help connect the left and right sides of the spinal cord. Then you have the posterior gray horn, lateral gray horn, and anterior gray horn. These were all lab terms. So the posterior horn is responsible for processing sensory information coming into the spinal cord from the spinal nerves. So it's going to have a lot of axons for sensory neurons and cell bodies of interneurons, so those integrating neurons that we've discussed before. The lateral horn is actually only found in the thoracic and upper lumbar and sacral regions, so not in the cervical region. This is going to have a lot of cell bodies of the autonomic motor nerves. So this goes to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and some glands. And then the anterior horn will have the cell bodies of the somatic motor neurons controlling skeletal muscles. And so this is going to be responses to this sensory information coming into the posterior horn. So here's again that cross section. So this is shown in yellow here, which is going to be the gray matter. So here's the posterior or dorsal horns. Here are anterior or ventral column horns right there. Lateral horns over here. We got that central canal in the middle. Here's lateral white column. Here is the posterior white column. This is going to be that anterior white column with the anterior median fissure right there. Central canal down the middle. Here's our actual cross section of a real spinal cord. It's been artificially stained. So looks a little different here than some of these diagrams, but there's going to be slight differences in the structures depending on the person. All right, ganglia. So ganglia is multiple, a ganglion is one. So this is a group of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. These are either going to be sensory or autonomic ganglia. The most common type is the dorsal root ganglion that we learned in lab. This is going to have a bunch of unipolar neurons with satellite cells surrounding it coming out of that dorsal root of the spinal nerve. And so we did see these in lab already. All right. It is going to, again, have that sensory information coming into it. That's why these are sensory ganglia. So we have a bunch of these posterior root or dorsal root ganglion all throughout our spinal column. So these sensory nerves come from the periphery of the body, so like the skin and arms and legs and stuff like that, bringing that information in, going in through that dorsal nerve root. We'll see some cell bodies and stuff in a slide or two, where we actually have a stained cross-section of some of these structures. All right. Whoops. Too far. I'm going to wrap up these other two first. Next we have cranial nerve ganglia, or ganglion. So we did not cover these in lab, but that's going to be associated with those cranial nerves, obviously. And then the autonomic ganglia are either going to be sympathetic chain ganglia that we did see in lab, and then not covered in lab are the paravertebral ganglia, prevertebral, and terminal ganglia. So we have a lot of these ganglia all over the body, these groups of those cell bodies, which is where those electrical impulses or chemical impulses will start and be processed if they're coming in from another neuron or structure. And so having that high concentration means that we can kind of process all of that information in the same general area, right? So here's that image I was talking about. This is the dorsal root ganglion. So here are axons but this structure right here is the actual ganglion. And so in here, all of these little dots are cell bodies. So that is a lot of neurons in there in that dorsal root ganglia. All right, coming out of that actual dorsal root from the spinal cord. Here's another view of that, kind of more zoomed in. So here's cell bodies of the sensory neurons, so these larger structures, and then the satellite cells are much smaller to kind of help out making sure those neurons are staying healthy and in good condition. Alright, we're going to end this video here, and then we will wrap up with our last video for this week, talking about the structure of spinal nerves themselves.